for joining today. My name is Wendy Pastrick. I work with Pragmatic Works. We're going to talk about always-on technologies today. I find that with the client work that I do, this is a conversation that I have over and over and over again. So hopefully if you've been considering using some always-on capabilities, and you've run into, probably some questions along the way, you can go ahead and type those in the, where is it, Liz? The question panel,
Yep.
right?
Yep, there's a questions panel.
The chat, is it the chat?
It's the questions panel.
Oh, it's questions, okay.
Yep.
So there's the questions panel. So go ahead and type those in, and Liz will keep an eye on that for me since I don't seem to be able to see it. So Liz, if you could let me know when there's questions, and we'll try to get to those.
Absolutely.
I want to take just a moment and apologize ahead of time. My lab went kaboom last night as I was working through some things, so I apologize. I do not have an actual environment to go in to manipulate the servers at this point, but hopefully the screenshots and the discussion will be good. So I do apologize for that because I know part of the abstract did mention that we would go through and we would set up an availability group. So having said that, I think we'll still get the information that you're looking for. Sorry, it just won't be as walkthrough as I would have liked it to have been. All right, so just a couple words about me. I am a data platform consultant with Pragmatic Works, hosting this Training on the T's seminar for you today, and Pragmatic Works does these every Tuesday and Thursday. So it sounds like there's the whole next month of April is dedicated to BI topics, or Power BI specifically, I think I heard you say, Liz. So we have that coming up every Tuesday and Thursday. If you have a little bit of time, go ahead and join us for those. So what I work with mostly in my job is pretty much everything that has to do with SQL Server databases, but some of my favorite things to work with are high availability, replication, and more lately working on some topics in Azure as well. I'm also a member of the PASS Board of Directors, so if you've attended any of your local chapter meetings, your local user group meetings, hopefully you're doing that, and if you haven't, I encourage you to go ahead and check those out. Have an opportunity to meet face-to-face with other people who do pretty much the same thing you do, and really easy to talk to, and it's great to be able to build that network. If you can't go in person, I'm actually in charge of what we call our virtual chapters, and the virtual chapters have sessions much like this one all throughout the month on various topics, so you can check all of that out at www.sqlpass.org. And if you're ever in the Chicago area, come and join us for our SQL Saturday in Chicago. And I want to thank Microsoft and my peers for nominating me for the last 2 years as a SQL Server MVP, and I'll find out tomorrow if I get renewed for my 3rd year or not. So excited about that. Okay, so let's talk about always on. All right, this gets so confusing to people because Microsoft decided, for whatever reason, to come up with a umbrella term for a couple of different high availability options that they have. And probably as more come on board, they'll continue to use always on to describe all of their high availability options. Right now, always on covers any high availability at the server or database level for Microsoft SQL Server. Right now, those things include failover cluster instances and these things called availability groups. Now here's where the confusion comes in, because availability groups are kind of a new thing, and because the term always on is also kind of a new thing, we get a lot of confusion. A lot of people automatically think that when they're talking about always on, they just mean availability groups. I want to just drive this home, and I'll say it a few times because it is very important when having conversations with people, that always on does not mean just availability groups. Availability groups mean availability groups. AlwaysOn means either a failover cluster instance configuration or a set of availability groups. So you have those things. I put this cute little dog picture up there, so hopefully if you don't remember what I just said, you'll remember the dog picture, and that'll cue you in and say, oh yeah, that's right, there was something about AlwaysOn that it's not just a dog, it's a dog with glasses and hair. So we have that, and that's where a lot of the confusion comes in. Okay. Some additional confusion comes in on some terminology at times. Okay. Again, separating the two, failover cluster instances and availability groups. Okay. With a failover cluster instance, we're going to talk about nodes in a cluster and an instance of SQL Server installed on a node. Okay. With availability groups, we're going to talk about replicas. So you have primary and secondary replicas. This is important because of the way that the technologies fail over and the capabilities that you have depending on if you're implementing a failover cluster instance versus implementing an availability group. Okay. All right. Are there any questions so far, Liz?
Not right now.
Okay. All right. So feel free, jump in if you have a question. That's fine. All right. To further differentiate between the two, okay, let's talk about some requirements that you have. All right. First of all, you can use SQL Server Standard Edition if you only need to support a failover cluster instance and you're limited to just 2 nodes. All right. I actually did have a client that just insisted once that, you know, no, we can use Standard Edition for our availability groups. You know, I can have two nodes, and again, that's what led me to believe that there is still a lot of confusion over, you know, what is an availability group versus what is a failover cluster instance. Okay, so failover cluster instance, again, we're talking about your traditional, what we've all, you know, had for years and years with the Microsoft operating system, Microsoft servers, and the Windows failover, Windows Server failover clusters. Okay, and putting SQL Server on top of that. Okay. Availability groups, however, not supported with Standard Edition. Okay, and I know that there's been lots of people who've asked for it. It is something that Microsoft is very aware that the community at large would very much appreciate to be able to have some type of support for availability groups in Standard Edition, but at this time it is still not an option. You are required to use Enterprise Edition. Okay, what do you get when you go ahead and you commit to Enterprise Edition? First of all, if you're using failover cluster instances, you can have more than 2. Okay, so whatever your operating system will support, that's how many you can have in your cluster configuration. As far as availability groups are concerned, okay, you can have a maximum of 8 secondary replicas, right? And 2 of those can be synchronous. Now, the other thing that sometimes people start thinking about when, or they put it in their, you know, their thoughts that, okay, well, availability groups is really the replacement for mirroring. And to an extent, that is true. It is mirroring is a deprecated feature, so at some point it will be going by the wayside. Okay, with mirroring, you were able to have that synchronous or asynchronous topology, and with availability groups, you can also take advantage of having synchronous or asynchronous replicas, but only 2 of them can be synchronous. And when we look at this later, you'll see that the configuration panel shows a maximum of 3 synchronous replicas, and that's because they're counting the primary as a synchronous replica as well. Okay, so only 8 total replicas, and 2 of them can be synchronous. Right. So how do we support all of this? Okay, you have to have Windows Server Failover Cluster. Why? Why do you need that? The services that are used for managing both failover cluster instances and availability groups all rely on those services that are installed with that operating system functionality. So it's under the covers. It's using it under the covers. The other thing that is required is this concept of quorum. And you know, I just realized I don't have a slide on quorum, but we're going to have to talk about quorum when we start talking about the failover cluster instances. All right, quorum is what determines if your cluster is in a healthy state or not. And without having all of the appropriate votes in your quorum, you could, or in your cluster, you could actually lose quorum and, in effect, have your entire cluster go offline because it's seen as not being in a healthy state. And believe me, if you've had that happen, it is certainly not an ideal situation. No one likes to have their cluster go offline. You know, it's okay to lose a node in a cluster sometimes, but oh goodness, you know, it just it's a trial and a tribulation for your entire cluster to go down because then you pretty much have nothing. If you're supporting a cluster today, you probably have multiple nodes in your cluster. Used to be clusters were often just 2 nodes, and people said that one was an active node and one was a passive node. Well, now clusters have, you know, 3, 6, 9. You know, they have any number of nodes, and each node in the cluster is actually used, you know, for some specific instance. You know, especially when you're talking about SQL Server. So you could have, you know, if you kind of picture a circle, you could have, you know, 3, well, or let's say a triangle, I guess. You know, and each point of that triangle would be a node in your cluster. Then you know, you can have application 1 running at the top, you can have application 2 running on the left, and you can have application 3 running on the right, and any of those could be set up to fail over to any of the other nodes if for some reason there was a loss of services to that particular server. So it doesn't translate as well to talk about anything but actual nodes when you're talking about your cluster. Okay, so quorum says that if I have these 3 servers in my cluster configuration, and we're talking about at the Windows level here, okay, quorum states that as long as I have a certain number of votes, and usually you want it to be more than half the votes, okay, we can continue to work inside of that cluster. If you go below that threshold, then your cluster is then taken offline. Okay, so quorum is really important, and even if you're working with availability groups, which don't appear to use the failover cluster functionality at all, if you're looking at it, it is still something that happens in the background, and it is still very important. Now, there's a lot of options when you're talking about quorum, and you can set up quorum to be anything from having that majority number of votes down to, you know what, as long as I have 1 participant in my cluster voting, my cluster is going to stay active. Okay, and there's a lot of different ways to configure that, and we could probably spend an entire session just talking about quorum and how to configure quorum. And it's something that each environment is going to be different. You know, there's no one way to determine how to configure your quorum settings for your cluster. You know, it really just depends on how much loss of services you can tolerate in your particular cluster. Okay, and you know, when you're talking about just a 2-node cluster, well, that's really easy because you have your node 1 and your node 2, and you say, okay, well, if both of them are active or voting, or both of them are able to vote for quorum, then okay, great, I keep my cluster running. But having an even number poses challenges, right? Because if you lose one of those two nodes, you don't necessarily want to lose connectivity from your application to your database in this case. So we create what's called a lot of times a file witness, okay, a file share witness. So that can be a voting member in your quorum as well. So usually the rule of thumb is that you want an odd number of votes, and that's really the most important piece to remember there, is that your quorum should be an odd number of votes, and if you can keep it to being a majority, then you're doing very well. Okay. All right. So let's compare and contrast then, so that's easier for you to take a look at. Failover cluster instances versus availability groups. Okay. Most importantly is the scope of what are you covering your butt for. Okay. With a failover cluster instance, you are protecting the entire SQL instance. What kind of things are included on the entire instance? Okay, it's not just your databases. Everyone automatically thinks, yeah, it's my databases, and it's true. It is your databases that you're covering yourself for. But you're also making sure that if something happens to that server, everything on that server is still going to be available on another node in your cluster. So that includes your databases, of course. It also includes your jobs, so any SQL agent jobs that you have, maybe those backup jobs, maybe you have some kind of ETL process that runs, anything that is on that SQL Server installation will also fail over to the other node, right? So security, another big one, right? So if you have a special security setup and you're not using a contained database, then you want to make sure that that security follows that database as well. Okay, so you have the entire instance. Failover cluster instances also utilize this thing called shared storage. Okay, with shared storage, all right, we're going to have, well, let's say go back to two nodes. We have two nodes in our failover cluster, and we have a SAN. Okay, so I have shared storage, which means that it doesn't matter which of those two nodes my SQL Server instance is actually running on at the time. The storage, those MDF and LDF and all the other files that I need, all of that is stored in one location on the SAN, and one location only. So I don't care where the services are running, it always is going to point back to that one centralized storage location. Okay. So let's compare this or contrast this to an availability group. So with an availability group, our scope now is an individual database, or it could be a group of databases. Okay. So I'm not protecting my entire SQL installation. I'm only protecting specific databases or sets of databases. Okay. So again, thinking about mirroring. Okay. Mirroring, you could set up a single database inside of mirroring, right? So you have a mirroring session, and it was for just one database. Now with availability groups, you can actually take multiple databases and have them fail over together. So if I have my application and I have employee data in an employee database, and I have order data in an order database, and I have customer data in a customer database, so let's say that I've partitioned it out or sharded it out that way, okay? I can have all three of those databases fail over at the same time should something happen to my server or to one of those databases if it loses connectivity, all three would fail over as a group, right? So this protects my application. It doesn't just protect the database itself, it protects the application. The reason that we can do that is because now we have separated storage, okay? So when I say that, what I mean is again, we have 2 nodes in our cluster, okay? We do not have the shared storage on the SAN this time. Now, the databases that are configured and running on node 1 are saved on one LUN, one set of drives on the SAN. All of my databases on node 2 are saved on a different drive on the SAN, or a different location on the SAN. They have their own set of drives, okay? Yes, that absolutely means that you now have to account for additional storage considerations, right? I have a client who has a terabyte worth of data, and they want to set up an availability group. They're going to have an additional terabyte of data somewhere to support that availability group. So there is definitely some overhead as far as storage is concerned. And everyone says, oh, well, storage is cheap, until you start talking to your SAN administration and to your management, right? So to a degree, having the separate storage can sometimes be a hindrance. Keep in mind, however, you also have that same requirement when you were setting up mirroring. Okay, you still had a second copy of your database. All right, and that's actually quite a benefit at times, because if something should happen to your data store, you now have another copy somewhere, instead of just having the one copy, which could be a single point of failure on a failover cluster instance. Now you have multiple copies of that data. So, you could think of it as a hot standby. Okay. All right. What about failover? How do these two things compare on failover? Okay. The configuration for a failover cluster instance is by node and by instance, right? So if I have SQL Server installed on node 1, and I also have node 2 and node 3 in my failover cluster, in my Windows cluster, so I have 3 possible nodes. I have a SQL Server instance installed on node 1. I can configure that instance to be able to fail over to either node 2 or node 3, and I can determine what my preferences are. Okay, so I can say, okay, well, right now my server is running on node 1, and if something happens to it on node 1, I'd really like it to run on node 3, because I know node 3 has more memory and a little more CPU availability. So I'm gonna prefer that it fails over to node 3. If for whatever reason it cannot fail over to node 3, then we'll go ahead and let it fail over to node 2. I might be running at a little bit with a little more limited resources, but it still has that option. And I configure that. When I set up my cluster, I configure that. Okay. This is all managed using the Failover Cluster Manager, which is a Windows utility. Okay. Compare that to the availability group. You can set up automatic or manual failover. Okay. You're only going to get automatic failover with those synchronous secondaries, and remember, you can only have 2, right? So you can have it set up as to which secondary you prefer to fail over, and you can also manually fail over if you want to start using some other features that limit you from using a synchronous replica. Okay, so if you have synchronous replicas, you can have automatic failover. If you have asynchronous replicas, it's a manual failover process. Okay, these options are all managed using the availability group dashboard, and we'll take a look at that in just a few minutes. Okay, all right. When you have a failover cluster instance, you do not have any access to the databases or the services or anything on those other failover nodes, right? It's all sitting there waiting in standby. Okay, again, I have nodes 1, 2, and 3. I have my SQL Server instance installed on node 1. I can't use that SQL Server instance, that same SQL instance, on nodes 2 or 3. What I can do, though, is I can have a different SQL Server instance running on node 2 and another different instance running on node 3. So I could theoretically still have 3 SQL servers that are completely independent of each other, yet the servers are all participating in this failover cluster configuration so that if something should happen to one of them, it can fail over and it would then share the services, the RAM, the CPU, all of that, with another node until I can get that node, until I can get the node that failed back up online. Okay, so I really don't have any access to the specific failover instance for that installation, but I can use the hardware for other things. Okay, give me just a second. All right, on the availability group side, since we're just looking at things at the database level, here we can actually have access to the replicas in a read-only manner. So I can configure my replica let's say that I just have one database in my replica at the moment. So I have one database. I can actually set that up so that it can be read-only. So I can get some use out of it. I'm already spending money for the instance, right? Because even though it may or may not have other databases on it, I'm still going to pay for the licensing for that second instance, and I'm still going to be supporting that additional storage. I might as well get some more use out of it, right? So I can point my reporting applications or my reporting portals to that read-only replica and actually be able to use it while it's in that secondary state. Okay. You could do that with, people argue you can do that with log shipping, you could do that with mirroring, but it takes some work, right? So the databases that are participating in log shipping or mirroring are not actually available. They are in a standby state, and they are waiting to receive updates, either from restoration of log files or from the transactions that are being passed through mirroring. So they're not really read-only. You kind of have to fudge that. You can make it work, but it's not out of the box, and it takes a little configuration, and there are times when you have to kick all the users out, especially for log shipping if you're restoring to that read-only copy. So the read-only replicas are it's a checkbox. It's a feature. It's right there. It's really easy to enable. Okay. The way that you are able to use that easily is this optional listener service, and the listener allows you to route your application, so your users won't even know that they're going to a different server for reports versus another server for data entry, even though they're the same database. Okay. And then finally, on the failover cluster side, your connectivity is managed through the cluster name. So your whatever SQL Server cluster name you decide to employ, it doesn't matter what node that SQL Server is currently running on. When you connect to that SQL Server instance, it will show you what you need to see, and you don't need to manage anything that way because it's only going to run on one node at any time. Okay, Liz, any questions as we're going?
Yeah, we have a couple. In what version of SQL Enterprise? Okay. In what version of SQL Enterprise are availability groups offered? Is it a SQL 2012 plus option?
Let's see, 2008 R2, I believe, was the first one, but definitely in 2012 and 2014.
Okay. Does availability group support file, stream, and service broker?
I want to say, I will verify that. I want to say yes to file stream, but I don't know. Service broker is so configurable. I'm not sure, but I'll make a note of that, and I will get an answer.
Okay, and then one more. If there are duplicate copies of the database, how does availability groups keep them in sync when it has to flip?
When it has to flip? All right, so there's actually a really good article out there written by Bob Ward who goes into super deep detail on how the transactions are actually applied from the primary to the secondaries. If you have and it's different if you have a synchronous configuration versus an asynchronous configuration. Basically it is keeping track of what was the most current transaction that was applied. And it is actually possible for a transaction to have been applied at your secondary before it was committed on your primary. So if you're running in that synchronous mode, that's what makes sure that everything stays in line with each other. And I would highly recommend checking out that Bob Ward article. So I will make a note of that as well and provide a link to that in the follow-up. Okay, thanks, Liz. All right. All right, so let's take a look at what this, I've been talking about nodes 1, 2, and 3 with my failover cluster instance. So here's what it looks like, right? Here's what it could look like, okay? Now in this diagram, I'm not using all 3 nodes for standalone SQL Server installations, okay? Node 1 has a SQL Server called SQL 1 on it. Node 2 has a SQL Server named SQL 2 on it. I have configured these entire SQL servers to be able to fail over to Node 3. So as you can see, I have an instance of SQL 1 and an instance of SQL 2 configured to run against Node 3. So if something should happen to SQL 1 on Node 1, it would fail over to Node 3. If something should happen to my SQL 2 instance on Node 2, it would fail over to Node 3. Now you may be asking yourself, well, Wendy, what if I lose both Node 1 and Node 2? Would they both run on Node 3? Hopefully I do have enough resources available there for that to happen. If I've done my planning well and I know that I have enough RAM and enough CPU and enough resources to support all of the things that I need to do on SQL 1 and SQL 2, they could both run on Node 3. But the other thing, see if anybody remembers, hopefully somebody remembers, the other thing to keep in mind is your quorum. If I lose both Node 1 and Node 2 in my failover cluster, does my quorum allow for me to run with just Node 3, or will my whole failover cluster go down? Will my cluster go down? Okay, and it depends on how I've configured it. If I say that all I need is for Node 3 to be able to vote, as long as I have one voting node, then keep the cluster running, then yes. If I've configured it in a different way, then it is possible that no, it might not. So there's more than just configuring what nodes fail over to where. There's also that lovely quorum piece that comes into play. All right. So there's our failover cluster instance. Remember, this is managed using the failover cluster manager. So this is a Windows service. So you don't get to this through SQL Server tools at all. All right, this is something that you manage from the operating system. And as you can see in this example, all right, there are 3 nodes, a primary 1, a primary 2, and a remote. All right, and there's and because of the way this one's set up, there's 2 networks. There's cluster network 1 and network 2, because this one's going across a subnet. But as you can see, this is what the failover cluster manager looks like, and you can actually see which nodes are running on, which installations are running on which nodes through here. Something else to point out in the middle section there in the gray part, it says preferred owners for AG1, which is my application. Okay, it's preferred to run on primary 1 or primary 2. So it can probably also fail over to remote 1, but I'm going to prefer that it only runs on primary 1 or primary 2. And there's a lot of configuration that goes on there. Another recommendation for you all, something that I highly, I've used a lot and I highly recommend it. Alan Hurt writes I consider him my personal authority on all things clustering, and especially when it comes to SQL Server clustering. He's got a lot of great materials on his blog, SQLHA.com, that will explain what's going on under the covers with the different quorum models that you can run, and how you can configure your cluster to maintain a healthy cluster. Okay. All right, let's look now at what an availability group setup will look like. Okay, so here again, I have node 1, node 2, and node 3, but this time I have 3 complete standalone SQL Server installations happening. Node 1 hosts SQL 1, Node 2 hosts SQL 2, Node 3 hosts SQL 3, right? The large, darker circular lines there show you 2 different availability groups, okay? On Node 1, I have a primary replica for my DB3. So this is the name of my database, and it is set up with a secondary over on the SQL 3 instance. So if something should happen to that database on node 1, it's going to fail over and be available for use on node 3.
Wendy, are you still there?
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Yep. I think I accidentally hit mute. All right. So I think where I was is now we're taking a look at node 2. And in node 2, on the SQL 2 instance, I have an availability group set up that hosts 2 databases on the primary replica. And in this case, CODB1 and CODB2. If something should happen where I lose connectivity to those databases, they are going to then fail over to the SQL 3 instance, both of them. Okay, so it is possible that I could be working on the SQL 2 instance, something happens, and 2 of my databases are now actually available over on the node 3 SQL 3 instance. If I still needed that DB3 database, I might be out of luck. Okay, so I can, I can have groups of databases fail over in an availability group. Okay. I could also configure some read-only, which I think actually I have that on a later slide. So we'll keep going here. Okay. When you're setting up an availability group, you actually have to enable the feature once your cluster, you still have to have the Windows cluster configured. So this does require, if you're not in a small shop and you're not, doing this all yourself, you're going to need to request that cluster configuration from someone on your infrastructure team or your IT department. So you definitely need that under the covers before you can enable an always-on availability group. And you do that through the SQL Server Configuration Manager. It's a property, so if you right-click on your server, your SQL Server service, if you will, then on that Always-On High Availability tab, there's a checkbox. The checkbox will be grayed out if you do not have a cluster configured, okay? Or if you're not running an appropriate version of SQL Server that you can actually use an availability group. So if you only have Standard Edition installed, not going to be able to check enable always-on availability groups. Right? Once you have done that, then back in SQL Server, let's see if I can pull that up without killing the rest of my screen here. I'm going to pull this over. Unfortunately, this is just my local installation. But right here, always on high availability. Okay, it's not going to actually let me do anything, but this is where you would come next to be able to complete your configuration for high availability or for availability groups. Okay. And there's a lovely wizard that pops up, and you go through, and all you do is you give your replica a name, you select what databases you're going to include in that replica, and then here is kind of the meat and potatoes of setting up an availability group. Okay, in here you'll see there's 4 tabs: replicas, endpoints, backup preferences, and listener. And this replica tab is really the key. Okay, you can see in here there are 3 server instances. So kind of like in my diagram, node 1, 2, and 3. This one is, call it lab 1, lab 2, and lab 3. Lab 1 is the primary. Lab 2 is secondary. Lab 3 is also secondary. But as you can see by the checkboxes, Lab 2 has been set up for automatic failover with a synchronous commit, okay, which they go hand in hand. So there's no, well, I guess you have. Well, and it's a readable secondary. Okay. Whereas Lab 3 is set up as a readable secondary, but it is not a synchronous commit, so there is no automatic failover. And this is where I told you that in the wizard it would say up to 3 under synchronous commit, because you can automatically fail over up to 2 additional nodes, but there's actually 3 nodes participating in the synchronous commit topology. Okay. Excuse me. All right. All right, so setting up readable secondaries this is where that happens. Okay, endpoints, just like in mirroring, those are how the communication between the nodes is happening. So that's automatically configured for you. You don't have to do anything special there unless you choose to. Backup preferences, I should have grabbed a screenshot of that, but we'll get to talking a little more in depth about backups in a minute, but you can choose, where to back up your databases. You don't have to only back up your primary. And then here also is where you would configure your listener. All right, so if you needed that listener to help route your traffic, and I have a slide dedicated to the listener in a little bit as well. All right. Okay, so once you have your availability groups configured, you use this dashboard that's in here. So again, right-clicking on Always On High Availability in your Object Explorer, you can open the dashboard. And I do wish I had one working here. As you can see, there's all these little hyperlinks under Availability Replica, Remote 1, Primary 1, and Primary 2, and Primary 1. And as you click those, it actually opens additional tabs at the top of your window. And sometimes I've seen people get lost, like, where am I? What am I looking at? Because it's a drill down technique, but it opens a new window. So if you're in there, try not to get too confused, because it keeps opening more windows. And if you click something and you think you're going back, it actually opens yet another window. So you do have to kind of keep a track of how many tabs you have open. All right. So in here we've set up an availability group called AG1. All right. There are 3 availability replicas. And the databases that are in here are this test 1 and test 2. So both of them are participating. And then there's also a listener configured too. Okay. So all of that was done through the wizard, and then you can review it using the dashboard. Okay. Another view of that in here, which is a little bit cleaner, I think, to look at. So here, I'm showing I have my 2 servers. I have my lab 01 at the top, and then toward the middle here I have my lab 02. All right. So you can see that my primary for availability group 1 is here on lab 1, and down here it shows a secondary for lab 2. The one thing we can't see is that if I expanded the databases here, under Lab 2, you would see that it shows as synchronizing. So you can't actually connect to the database and manually run queries, but you could use that listener service to redirect to it. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. All right. A few more differences. All right. We've talked a little bit about the read-only option. All right, so this is differences between a failover cluster instance and an availability group replica. Okay, so that read-only option is really key, right? So you're, like I said, you're paying for the storage, you're paying for the additional licensing on the server potentially. So why not be able to use it? You know, get more money for, or get more use for the money that you're putting into it, right? So we want to be able to use that. The other thing we can do is we can offload backups. So we can decide, all right, if my application is running against node 1, but, you know, I'm performing backups pretty frequently, you know, even if it's only once a night, but, you know, my server actually gets hit constantly. So, you know, taking that extra time to do the backup, you know, is really impacting other processes. So why don't I run the backup on one of my other nodes, let's say node 2. All right, so now I've had that option in the wizard to determine, you know, what is my preferred node for backup. You know, so if I have that set, then it will be able to take backups off of a different node. Now you can take full backups, you can take T-log backups. What you can't do, however, is you cannot take differential backups. So that is something that is not an option. When you're offloading your backups. Okay. Keep that in mind. All right, so 2 big benefits of having an availability group over a failover cluster instance. Read-only and offloading of those backups. All right. The read-only comes in by virtue of this availability group listener. Okay, so this is unique to an availability group. All right, you need to have a unique DNS name, so kind of like a cluster name, if you will. Your application is going to connect to that virtual network name, right, the DNS name. So it has to be unique, obviously, and that's how you're going to route your traffic. You can have more than one virtual IP address that your listener routes to. So if you do have a multi-node configuration and you have multiple read-only copies, maybe the reporting portion of your application routes to node 2, and maybe part of your application that only deals with employee data routes to node 3, and everything else stays on your primary node, which is node 1. So you can have it work that way. With the availability groups. Okay, the virtual IP, we just talked about that. It is recommended, highly recommended, to use static IP addresses for these. And then I've shown you a couple of connection strings that allow you to make sure that you're using integrated security. And then if you have a multi-subnet failover, that is also set to true. All right, so that your listener knows which way to route your traffic. Okay, and in both of these cases, the listener was named AG listener, so that's what that is. So setting the connection to use this AG listener availability group listener. That sounds so redundant. Okay, so something like that then going back to looking at what we had before with our availability group cluster, our availability groups set up on node 1, that primary with my DB3. I could have the listener route read-only traffic to my DB3, and then on node 2 with my with my availability group that includes the 2 databases, CODB1 and DB2, I can actually have that configured to back those up on SQL 3, on node 3. And so it gives me a lot of flexibility, whereas I didn't necessarily have that type of flexibility with just installing a failover cluster instance. All right, so that's an awful lot of words. To go back to our first slide, all right, talking about getting to the point, what is always on? Always on is just plain and simple high availability for SQL Server. There's a couple of different ways to implement it, and then there's lots of options depending on which path you take. If you go the failover cluster instance route or if you go the availability groups route, you have lots of options. So remember the dog with the glasses and the hair. So it's more than just one thing. And Liz, any more questions? As we're wrapping
Yeah.
up here, have time
Yeah,
for
we
a
have
few
a
more.
couple. If in-memory OLTP is a memory-optimized database, is configurable in availability, what are the options available to configure?
For the for the in-memory, I have actually not done that myself, so I will have to take note of that and
Okay.
see what happens there. I am not sure. That's a good question.
Okay.
I know that because of the way that you need to configure your server to use in-memory objects, if it is supported, you would definitely need to be able to you would definitely need those resources available on the other node for the availability group, and then you're getting also into the question of are your tables persisted or not. So I don't really know. There's a couple of things that impact that. So I will see if I can get an answer quickly for you on that.
Okay. If we have Windows failover cluster, then do we need SQL cluster before going to the availability group?
No, so that's the difference. If you install the SQL cluster, if you install SQL instances in a failover cluster to be able to participate as a failover cluster instance, then actually you're not able to use an availability group. That is one of the caveats. So if I have my 3-node cluster and I have my SQL 1 and SQL 2 instances installed, but for some reason both of those nodes are failover cluster instances for SQL Server. So SQL 1 can fail over to the node hosting SQL 2, and SQL 2 can fail over to the node hosting SQL 1. I actually am I'm not allowed to create an availability group for either of those nodes for either of those SQL Server installations on either of those nodes. I'd have to have a third node that is not participating in a failover cluster and a SQL Server failover cluster instance configuration, and then I can use that node.
Okay. Can you point the document of quorum config? Can you point to the document of quorum config, I guess is what they're asking.
Let's see. I know if you look at Alan Hurt's website, I know that he has a lot of information about that. There's also a lot of really good books too. I'm not sure if I can pull it up really quickly, but I can show you Alan's website. And let's see, quorum. If I spelled it right. Yeah. So he has several articles in here. And so as you can see, there's he has lots of good links in here. SQLHJ.com. Okay. Anything else, Liz?
Yeah. Sounds like nodes 1 and 3 normally are on different machines or disks. What about with a SAN or VM environment?
So it doesn't matter if it's direct attached storage or SAN storage. So your SQL and it can also run on virtual machines. Again, doesn't matter if it's direct attached or virtual storage. I know there are some considerations if you are in a virtualized environment and you're hosting failover cluster instances with the shared storage. There's some workarounds, and those are fairly well published as well. But you do need to be aware, and I think that's only with VMware. I think if you're using Hyper-V, you don't have those issues.
Okay. Is there anything about mirroring by AlwaysOn?
So instead of mirroring with SQL, getting into SQL 2012 and 2014, that's a deprecated feature, and you're going to want to look at using availability groups instead of mirroring.
Okay. I think that's all the questions we have.
All right. Well, thank you all so very much. And I have the, oh, sorry, I guess I have one more slide. So if you need to contact me, and I'll be posting, I usually post everything, all my resources out on my blog, thewendyverse.com. And feel free to just send me an email if you need anything, or if I can help in any way. And then you can also find me on Twitter.
Okay. Great. Thanks, everyone.